The archivist set his recording equipment on the table between us, a flat disc, no larger than a coin, and asked me to start wherever felt natural. Told him nothing about this feels natural. He smiled and said that was fine, that most veterans said exactly that, and I thought, no, they don't, because most veterans don't know what I know. And most veterans aren't sitting across from a 23-year-old with a recording disc trying to decide whether to tell him the thing that would make every history book on 4 settled worlds completely wrong. I looked at my wrist. Old habit. There's nothing there now. Hasn't been for 11 years. The skin is clean. Just the normal faint lines of age running across the inside of the joint. But I looked anyway. And the archivist noticed, because that's his job, and he asked me if something was wrong with my hand. Nothing, I told him. Old scar. He wrote that down. He shouldn't have. There's no scar. I'm going to tell you how I walked out of the Vethara intake pavilion on the 31st day of the Ethari Continuance's 4th population sweep. I am going to tell you that I was the most thoroughly flagged human operative in 3 survey sectors, that the Aethari had my biometric signature in 17 separate census registers, that I was in their system as priority reclassification, which is the continuance's term for immediate termination of census anomaly, which is their term for killing someone who has moved through too many of their registration checkpoints without being formally catalogued, is their term for people like me. I am going to tell you all of that, and then I am going to tell you about a corpsman named Redo Dahl who couldn't find his data tablet on a battlefield outside the Sereth Transit corridor 11 days earlier and used a ballpoint pen instead. If you remember nothing else from this recording, remember Redo Dahl. He saved my life with a pen. He doesn't know it. I've never told him. After today I'm going to call him, and I'm going to have a very awkward conversation, and I suspect he's going to be insufferable about it for the rest of his natural life. He's earned it. But let me back up. Let me tell you what the Ethari continuance is, because I don't trust the standard briefing documents. I've read them, and they make the continuance sounds like a bureaucratic inconvenience, like a slow customs authority with aggressive paperwork, and that is the most dangerous possible misunderstanding of what they actually are. The Ethari are not bureaucrats. They are not paperwork. They are a census. I mean that in the most precise, most alarming sense of the word. The continuance is a collective biosynthetic intelligence, partly organic, partly machine, entirely distributed, that has built its entire civilization around the act of counting things. Not controlling things, not conquering things, counting them, cataloging them, registering them in a census so complete, so granular, so deeply recursive that by the time an Ethari population sweep has finished processing a species, that species exists inside the continuance's registry at the level of individual cell type distribution per cubic centimeter of body mass, age cohort, per generation of ancestry going back as far as their records reach. They don't want your planet. They don't want your resources. They don't want tribute or territory or the surrender of your military assets. They want to know how many of you there are, exactly what you are made of, exactly how you are distributed across the space you occupy, and they want that information correct and complete and current in perpetuity. If you've been counted and catalogued and your census entry is current, you are no threat to the continuance. You are a data point. You are fine. If you haven't been counted, if your biometric signature appears in their passive scans but you have no corresponding census registration, or worse, if you appear in their scans in ways that are inconsistent with your registered census entry, then you are what they call an anomaly. And anomalies in the Ethari continuance are not tolerated. Not because anomalies are dangerous or threatening, because the Aethari feel any particular hostility toward unregistered individuals, because an unregistered individual represents an error in their census. And the Ethari cannot have errors in their census. An error in the census is, to the Ethari, something like what a crack in a load-bearing wall is to an engineer. Not just a cosmetic problem, not just an inconvenience, but a structural failure that calls the integrity of the entire edifice into question. If one data point is wrong, then every data point derived from it is also potentially wrong. And if those derived data points inform census projections, And those projections are now embedded in 17,000 downstream records. You see the problem. The Ethery see it very, very clearly, so they fix errors thoroughly. The way you fix a crack in a load-bearing wall is not to paint over it and hope. Priority reclassification means this anomaly is significant enough that it must be resolved before any further census work in the affected sector can be considered reliable. Resolved means the anomaly is either correctly registered, if that's still possible, or removed from the dataset entirely. Removal from the dataset means what you think it means. I had been operating as a deep survey liaison for the Joint Human-Alien Frontier Authority 6 years at that point. My job, in the simplest terms, was to move through contested and semi-contested space in the Serath Corridor, the border region between the reach of human settlement and the outer edge of Athari population sweep territory, and gather information on Athari census movements. Where were they sweeping? What populations had they already catalogued? What settlements were about to fall inside their active survey radius? Were there communities that needed to be warned, relocated, or registered before the sweep reached them and classified them as anomalies? That last part was the core of the work. The Ethery's population sweeps were not secret. They were not covert. The continuance announced them through formal broadcast well in advance and invited all resident populations within the projected sweep radius to present themselves voluntarily at designated intake pavilions for census registration. The registration process was, they assured everyone, completely safe, completely painless, completely without political implication. A census, not a conquest. This was true. The Ethery were not lying. The vast majority of populations in the Serath Corridor, voluntary registration was the correct choice. The alternative, being caught outside the registered dataset when the sweep's passive scan net reached your sector, was considerably worse. Problem was my job. A deep survey liaison is, by definition, a person who moves through registered Ethery sweep territory while carrying a biometric profile that does not match any Ethery census registration. That's what makes the job possible. You can't gather intelligence on an Athari sweep from inside a registered population. The census tracks all registered individuals continuously, and an anomalous individual moving through registered space is immediately flagged. You can only do the job from outside the census, off the dataset, which means, by definition, you are an anomaly. Which means priority reclassification applies to you the moment the passive scans get a confident read. We knew this. Every liaison operative knew this. We had been trained on it, briefed on it, and required to sign an acknowledgement of it before beginning active operations. The authority was brutally clear. If you are detected, cannot extract you. The continuance's sweep territory is too deep, their sensor grid too dense, and their response protocols too fast. If you are detected, your only option is to reach an intake pavilion voluntarily and attempt to register before the priority flag is actioned. To escape the sweep radius entirely, before the flag propagates through the system. Reaching a pavilion voluntarily had a theoretical success condition. If you could get registered before the priority reclassification order was issued against your biometric profile, you became a data point instead of an anomaly. The system couldn't hold both a valid census entry and an active priority reclassification order against the same biometric ID. Registration would win. In theory. In practice, the timing was nearly impossible. Priority reclassification orders propagated through the continuance system in under 4 minutes from the moment of confident biometric identification. And the moment the priority order reached the pavilion, every census terminal inside it would flag your biometric signature as a reclassification case and route you to termination processing instead of registration. We called this the 4-minute problem, and nobody had ever solved it. The standard guidance for detected operatives was, run for the perimeter. Try to clear the sweep radius before the passive scan net gets a second confident read on your profile. Keep moving. Keep jamming your surface biometric signature with whatever countermeasure package you're carrying, and hope the first read was not clean enough to generate a confident identification. I had been jamming my surface signature for 6 years, with considerable success, across 11 separate deep survey deployments in Ethery sweep territory. I was very good at it. My countermeasure package suppressed the passive scan readable surface biometrics, the skin depth chemical signature profile, the thermal emission pattern, the microgravity variance of my mass distribution, and 17 other scan readable surface attributes. It did not suppress my deep biometrics. Nobody's countermeasure package suppressed deep biometrics, because you cannot suppress deep biometrics without suppressing the functions that keep you alive. Deep biometrics are bone density distribution, organ mass ratios, neural pathway density estimates derived from cranial geometry, metabolic heat diffusion gradients, and 23 other attributes that the Ethere's deep census scanners read. At ranges of up to 300 meters through walls. Clothing, standard countermeasure packages. They are what they sound like. The census data that lives inside you, not on you. For 6 years, the Ethere's passive sweep sensors had never gotten a clean enough surface read on me to generate a confident biometric ID and cross-reference to my deep profile. The surface jamming worked. The deep profile was never triggered. I want to be honest about what 6 years of that does to a person, not the danger. I don't mean the obvious thing, the accumulated weight of operating inside a system that would kill you if it found you. Anyone who has done this kind of work knows the danger and has made their peace with it before they take the first deployment. Because if you haven't made your peace with it, you will not survive the first deployment long enough for the danger to matter. I mean the other thing it does to the way you perceive systems. Every deep survey liaison I have ever known comes back from their first deployment with a new way of looking at how information moves through a structure. You stop seeing organizations as collections of people making decisions. You start seeing them as collections of data flows, inputs, classification events, routing decisions, outputs. You start asking about every system you encounter. What does it look for? What does it recognize? What does it route to review? And what does it set aside? Because the gap between what a system looks for and what it actually encounters in the world is the only place you can operate. The Aetheri Continuance's census system was the most sophisticated I had ever worked around. Not because it was hostile. It wasn't hostile. It was simply thorough. But because thoroughness at that scale generates very few gaps. 6 years I had operated in the one gap the Continuance's system had. The difference between a clean surface scan read and the 0.8-second reset window. That was the whole gap. One small technical timing-dependent vulnerability in a countermeasure system that my team had spent 3 years engineering. Everything else about the Continuance's census was, as far as I could determine, complete. There is a particular kind of attentiveness that develops when you spend enough time in spaces where being noticed means you don't come home. It isn't paranoia. Paranoia makes you irrational, and irrational operatives die. It's closer to a very fine-grained awareness of every system you're moving through. What it's looking for, precisely how close you are to its edge at any given moment. I knew the Aetheri census sensors the way a careful driver knows ice on a road. Not fearfully, but precisely, with full respect for what happens if the conditions change. The 12th deployment had been routine until the 14th day. That is, I should tell you, the most dangerous sentence in any operational debrief. Routine is the condition you operate in when nothing has gone wrong yet. It is not a description of safety. It is a description of luck that hasn't been tested. I had entered the sweep territory through the Serath Corridor's northern transit node, an unmanned industrial relay station that the Aetheri sweep had not yet reached and that I had used as an insertion point on 3 previous deployments. The insertion was clean. The countermeasure package was running well. My first week had been productive. I mapped the sweep's movement timeline across 4 settlement clusters. Identified 2 communities that were going to need urgent warning to present themselves voluntarily before the sweep's passive scan net reached them. Passed that information through the authorities' communication relay protocol. The communities I warned were the Duvani settlement at Velshan and the mixed human Sethori transit community at Orath Point. The Duvani had already known about the sweep and were preparing for voluntary registration. The Orath Point community had not. A small, relatively recent settlement, mostly transport workers and their families, who had arrived in the corridor just before the sweep's notification broadcasts began. They registered in time. I did not know that until months later, but I know it now. And I mention it because it took on a weight warrant for me after everything that happened in Ather Van Doss, because I was still alive to hear about it. The pen, the cue, the 32-second gap. The injury that earned me Redo's pen happened on the approach to Ather Van Doss, 3 days before the detection event. I was crossing an elevated transit causeway on foot in pre-dawn light when a section of the outer edging, old infrastructure, poorly maintained in the way everything at the edge of contested territory is poorly maintained, gave way under a misplaced step. I caught myself on the railing before I went over, but the impact torqued my left shoulder and left a long grazed impact across my forearm from wrist, elbow. It was not serious. The field medical kit had everything I needed, but Redo Dahl, part of the support element providing the deployment's rearguard coverage from a forward relay position outside Ather Van Doss, caught up with me at the edge of the settlement and immediately did what Redo always did: a full field assessment regardless of what I told him about severity. He was thorough and quick, which is the correct way to be. He applied topical treatment to the graze, determined the shoulder torque was muscular rather than structural, dispensed a pain suppressor, and reached into his kit for his data tablet to log the assessment. The tablet was not responding. It had been running slow all morning, 3 sync cycles behind the deployment feed, freezing on the case entry screen. Redo had been arguing with it intermittently for 2 days. Now it gave him a blank screen and a spinning load indicator that did not resolve. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he reached into his kit, found the ballpoint pen that lived in the front pocket alongside his stylus and his light pen, and wrote his triage assessment string on the inside of my left wrist in 30 seconds. He did not explain why. He did not ask permission. He wrote the string, capped the pen, put it back in his kit, and told me the shoulder would be stiff for 2 days, and I should avoid overhead reaches on the causeway work. I told him I would try to avoid overhead reaches in general. He told me I should work on that. That was the last conversation I had with Redo Dahl before the detection event. He moved back to the forward relay position, moved into Ather Van Doss. 3 days later, the reset interval caught me. My countermeasure package ran in continuous cycles of 47 seconds active, 0, 8 seconds inactive, while it reset its signal modulation parameters. The inactive window was necessary. The package's jamming signals required calibration every cycle, or they degraded into a pattern the Ethere's scan systems would learn to read around. For 6 years, that 0, 8-second window had never been a problem. The fixed deep census arrays that the Athere mounted in populated areas broadcast their active scan pulses on a 12-second cycle, and the probability of a mobile Ethere field census unit being close enough and oriented correctly to get a clean surface read during a specific 0.8-second window was very low. On the 14th day, a continuance field census unit in a doorway on the eastern side of Ather Van Doss's transit market ran an active passive scan sweep at the exact moment my package was in its reset interval. The unit's scan pulse caught me at a range of 14 meters, clean, during the full 0.8-second window. Confident biometric identification, surface and deep. 17 census registers flagged simultaneously. Priority reclassification, my biometric ID. The 4-minute clock started. I knew it started because my tactical feed ran a continuous passive monitor on local Ethere census broadcast frequencies, lit up with the priority flag, carrying my biometric ID header. The flag was propagating outward through the census network at standard priority broadcast speed. At that moment, I had roughly 3 minutes and 40 seconds before it reached the nearest intake pavilion. The nearest intake pavilion was the Vithara intake pavilion, main registration hub for the Dorothseen population sector, located in the civic processing district of the exchange world of Dorothseen, the largest pavilion within 600 kilometers. It was also, according to my tactical feed, 2 minutes and 50 seconds from my current position at standard transit corridor speed. I ran. Want to be precise about what that meant. I was carrying a full deep survey field kit, countermeasure package, tactical feed array, personal defense module, 11 days of compressed rations, 2 liters of water, a medical kit, an emergency beacon I was not allowed to activate, and a very old ballpoint pen that had somehow migrated into the external chest pocket of my jacket over 6 years of deployments, possibly because I used it occasionally to mark paper maps when my stylus battery died, and I had never gotten around to throwing it away. 2 minutes and 50 seconds, at a run, carrying everything. I made it in 2 minutes and 38 seconds. The priority reclassification flag had reached 67% propagation through the census network when I crossed the outer threshold of the Vithara intake pavilion and joined the end of the registration queue. 67%. Not at the pavilion yet. Registration was still possible. The Vithara intake pavilion was extraordinary. Briefing schematics don't capture the scale. The main registration hall was a single room, approximately 200 meters long and 60 meters wide, with a ceiling that arched 40 meters overhead in a continuous curve of pale synthesized stone, lit by arrays of full-spectrum panels that flooded the space with something approximating noon daylight. Bright, even, casting almost no shadows, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly clinical, slightly too clear, slightly too visible. The Etheri are a species that likes to see what they are counting. The pavilion was built for visibility. The registration queue was long. Fourth population sweep had been running for 31 days, and what remained at this point was the tail of the voluntary queue. The hesitant, the disorganized, the communities that had arrived late and, like me, the people who were there because they had run out of other options. There were perhaps 400 individuals in the registration hall. Mixed species. Humans, Sethori, Duvani, a cluster of Kethavar traders who had apparently been operating in the sweep radius without realizing it and were now registering with the expressions of people facing a very unpleasant conversation with their logistics coordinator. Census terminals lined both long walls, each staffed by an Aetheri census clerk, tall, pale, their biosynthetic bodies moving with the precise, economical efficiency of systems that have no reason to hurry because they never make mistakes, and therefore never need to correct them. Above the terminals, running the full length of both walls, the Etheri had mounted their deep census scanner arrays, a row of oval-mouthed sensor housings in brushed gray material, each one tracking continuously through the registration space, reading every individual in the room at depth, continuously, building and updating the population census in real time. I checked my tactical feed. Priority reclassification flag was at 74% propagation. I counted the queue ahead of me. 11 individuals. Processing speed at the nearest terminal was approximately 2 minutes 40 seconds per individual. That was not going to work. Priority flag would reach the pavilion census terminals at roughly the 93% propagation mark. At current queue speed, I would be at the terminal at somewhere around the 98% mark, 5% gap, in the wrong direction. This is the part where most people would start thinking about exits. The pavilion had 4. I had memorized all of them in my pre-deployment briefings, because that is the kind of preparation that keeps you alive, and all 4 were covered by permanent deep census scan arrays. An unregistered individual moving toward an exit, while a priority reclassification flag was actively propagating through the system, would be flagged by the passive scan net before they reached the door. The exits were not options. The queue was not going to move fast enough. The exits were not options. The 4-minute problem had caught up to me in the most comprehensive way possible. I was inside the solution, close enough to touch it, and the timing was going to kill me. I stood in the queue and I thought about what I knew and what the Etheri knew and on what the gap between those things might be. 81%. 83. The queue moved. 86. I was 6th from the terminal now, and the flag was at 86% propagation, and I was working through the problem of how I was going to be anywhere other than 2nd or 3rd from the terminal when the flag arrived. And I was not finding a satisfactory answer. That was when I became aware of the pressure on my inner left wrist. Not a physical sensation. Exactly. More the way you become aware of something you haven't actively thought about in 11 days, because there was no reason to think about it. I looked down. Short-sleeved field shirt, and on the inside of my left wrist, in a cramped and very legible hand, 9 digits in 2 groups of 4 and 1 separated by dashes. Redo Dahl's pen. Eto's triage string format was 9 digits in 2 groups of 4 and 1, separated by dashes. First 4 digits were a date time stamp in a compressed military notation. The second 4 were a sequential case identifier unique to his personal triage log. The single final digit was a severity code. He wrote them in ballpoint ink, because ballpoint ink on skin is water-resistant, sweat-resistant, and lasts for approximately 2 weeks before it begins to fade. 11 days in, the string was still legible, not fresh. The edges slightly soft from a week and a half of field exposure, but legible. I looked at it. Chit. And then I looked at these scanner arrays running along the walls above the terminals, and I thought a very specific thing in a very particular order. The ethery continuance is a biosynthetic collective. Their material culture, their tools, their infrastructure, their record keeping, their data management, is entirely organic or fully digital. They do not have analog intermediary technologies. They never developed them. The evolutionary path of ethery civilization moved directly from biological information storage, biochemical signaling, genetic record keeping, organic data structures, to full digital systems. They skipped the entire intermediate period of material analog technology. No paper, no ink, no mechanical printing, no handwriting. These things are not part of their technological history or their sensory vocabulary. The ethery deep census scanner was the most sophisticated population assessment instrument that any known civilization had ever produced. Could read bone density distribution to within 2% accuracy at 300 meters. It could reconstruct organ geometry from thermal diffusion gradients. It could identify an individual from among a population of 10 million. Registered census entries using a biometric signature derived entirely from passive scan data. It could not identify ballpoint ink on skin as anything other than a surface contaminant. Because ballpoint ink on skin is not a biological attribute, it is not a chemical signature in any category. The scan's classification algorithms recognized as biometrically significant. It is not thermal. It is not structural. It produces no metabolic signal. It is, to a deep census scanner designed to read living biological systems, essentially invisible, or rather visible but unclassifiable, read as a non-biological surface deposit of ambiguous composition, flagged for low priority review and set aside. I did not know this for certain. I could reason toward it. From what I knew about ethery civilizational history and what I knew about the scanner's classification architecture from 6 years of study, I could not be certain. I had a hypothesis built on the intersection of ethery civilizational history and the specific properties of ballpoint ink on human skin, and I had a priority reclassification flag at 89% propagation, and I had perhaps 90 seconds before the terminal ran my deep census scan, and the flag arrived at the same moment. The queue moved. I was fourth from the terminal, 91%. I decided the hypothesis was the only option I had that wasn't already closed. A hypothesis with an unknown probability of success was worth more than no option at all. I decided this not with any particular confidence or courage, but with the specific clarity of a person who has just finished methodically eliminating every alternative and arrived at the last one remaining. I also decided to move closer to the scanner array before reaching the terminal, in the theory that if the scanner was going to read the ink and classify it, I would rather know before I reached the clerk's terminal than at the moment the clerk's screen lit up with a priority reclassification flag. I moved 2 steps to my left, putting myself directly under one of the oval-mouthed sensor housings. I held my left wrist slightly forward, turned inward, the 9-digit string facing the scanner housing. The scanner housing continued its tracking arc. It passed over me, it moved on. Tactical feed showed no new flags, no classification event, no surface anomaly alert, no secondary scan request. The queue moved. 94% propagation, third from the terminal. I held the wrist forward again as the scanner arc came back, same result. The sensor tracked across me, logged my deep profile against the census database, and the ink on my wrist generated nothing observable at the feed level. It was going into a queue somewhere. I was almost certain of that. The scanner was seeing it, classifying it as something it didn't recognize, and setting it aside for later. The question was whether later was before or after my census registration completed. 96%. Second from the terminal. The individual immediately ahead of me in the queue was an elderly human male, a civilian, some kind of transit worker, or small settlement resident who had come to the pavilion with the resigned patience of someone who has dealt with institutional processes long enough to have made peace with the waiting. He was carrying a cloth bag with both hands, and he smelled of the particular industrial lubricant that the Sareth Corridor's maintenance infrastructure used on its transit machinery. He moved forward when his turn came, submitted to the scan without any visible discomfort, received his certificate with a small nod, and moved away. The clerk's screen cleared. I stepped forward. The deep census scan takes 11 seconds. I know this because I counted every one of them. The scanner array above the terminal tracked across me twice during those 11 seconds. On the second pass, my tactical feed updated, priority reclassification flag at 97% propagation. Pavilion census terminals had not yet received the flag. The terminal in front of me was still processing my scan as a standard voluntary registration. At second 8 of the scan, the census terminal's display populated with my deep biometric profile. The clerk reviewed it with the brief, systematic attention ethery clerks give to completed scans. Checking for data completeness, confirming quality was sufficient for permanent census entry. At second 10, the clerk's eyes moved to the lower section of the display, the surface attribute summary, the final section of the scan result that catches anything the deep census missed and logs it separately. I watched the clerk's face, the same professional neutrality, a brief pause. The clerk's fingers moved over the input surface, making a classification entry, low priority surface deposit, environmental particulate. The flag arrived at the pavilion's census terminals at 98% propagation, which, on the clock I was running in my head, was approximately 32 seconds after the clerk entered the classification and began generating registration certificate. 32 seconds. The terminal updated. I saw it happen. The clerk's display acquired a new notification at the top of the screen. A priority flagged indicator in the A3's standard alert notation, the census red color that the continuance used for high-severity system notices. The clerk paused. Not a human hesitation, not visible emotion, just the ethery pause. A brief absence of forward motion while internal processing resolved a conflict. Then the clerk looked at me. Then the clerk looked at the terminal. Then the terminal printed the certificate, and the clerk handed it to me. Register conflict resolution protocol had activated. On one side, a completed census registration for biometric ID Sable Oren, entered 32 seconds ago, data quality confirmed, surface attribute summary logged, certificate in generation. On the other side, priority reclassification order for biometric ID Sable Oren arrived 32 seconds after the registration was completed. The continuance's census logic is unambiguous on this conflict. A completed census registration is a data point. Priority reclassification order is an instruction to resolve a data inconsistency. If the inconsistency has already been resolved, if the anomalous biometric profile now has a valid census entry, then the priority order is moot. The inconsistency no longer exists. The flag is archived as resolved by registration. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. The clerk's display cleared the priority notification. The registration certificate completed its generation cycle. The clerk reached for it, lifted it from the output tray, and held it out to me. The clerk's expression was, "This is the part I have thought about more than any other part of this story composed." Not suspicious, not confused, not the face of a system that had just been narrowly outmaneuvered. The face of a process that had encountered a minor timing anomaly in its conflict resolution protocol, resolved it according to its own stated logic, and was moving on. I took the certificate. I thanked the census clerk. I walked away from the terminal. I did not run. Running, when you have just had a priority reclassification flag archived against your census registration, is inadvisable. Running is what anomalies do. Registered individuals walk. I walked across the full length of the Vithara Intake Pavilion's registration hall, 200 meters under the broad, full-spectrum daylight panels, past the remaining queue, past 3 more census clerk stations, past the wall-mounted scanner arrays, that tracked across me continuously and read my newly registered census entry and found it valid and moved on. And I walked out through the main entrance into the bright daylight of Dorothy's Civic District. I walked 4 blocks. I turned into a transit corridor. I sat down on a low wall in a patch of direct sunlight and looked at Red O'Doll's ink on my wrist. I looked at it for a long time. The Civic District of Dorothy was active at that hour, mid-morning by the local clock cycle. The Exchange World's particular quality of light, falling flat, and even across the stone-paved transit corridors, and the open-air market stalls that occupied the lower level of the surrounding administrative complex. Ethery citizens moved through the space with the characteristic efficiency of a people who have never developed the habit of wandering. They moved purposefully, in straight lines, from origin point to destination point, with none of the lateral drift that most species exhibit when they have time to spare, and no immediate objective. The census had given all of them a destination. They were data points. They were going somewhere. I was a data point too now. First time in 12 deployments, I was officially registered in the Athari Continuances census. I had a valid entry. I had a certificate in my kit. I had, as far as the continuances system was concerned, always been a legitimate resident of the sweep territory who had simply taken 31 days to get around to voluntary registration. The system did not record the priority reclassification flag that had been archived against my entry 32 seconds after that entry was created. Conflict Resolution Protocol archived it, resolved it, and moved it to the historical record. It was closed. I was clean. I looked at the ink. I want to describe what that moment felt like, because I've spent 11 years not telling anyone about it, and part of the reason I'm here is that I want the feeling on record somewhere, not just the facts, because I've spent 11 years not telling anyone about it, and part of the reason I'm here is that I want the feeling on record somewhere, not just the facts. It didn't feel like triumph. Whatever you're imagining, the operative who outwitted the machine, the human quality that perfect Athery logic couldn't classify, it didn't feel like any of that. It felt very small. It felt like the specific kind of luck that arrives in the wrong shape. Not good fortune, exactly, but the absence of bad fortune is different in a way that's hard to explain. The priority reclassification flag hadn't resolved in my favor because I was clever or prepared, because human adaptability had done something remarkable. It had resolved because Red O'Doll had run out of data tablets 11 days ago, and because the Ethery's deep census classification algorithms had encountered a technology so thoroughly outside their civilizational experience that they'd put it in the wrong category and moved on. I had not outwitted them. Red O's pen had, an object that none of us had thought about for a single second. There's a version of this story I could tell where the moral is about human ingenuity, or adaptability, or the things that fall through the cracks of a system that believes it can categorize everything. I've thought about those framings over the years, and they're not wrong, exactly. The Ethery Continuance's deep census system is genuinely extraordinary, more comprehensive, more accurate, more deeply recursive than anything our own census infrastructure could produce. The continuance has been counting living things for longer than human civilization has been agricultural, but they built it from within a particular civilizational experience. Organic record-keeping, then digital record-keeping, with nothing in between. No period of ink and paper, and the unrepeatable idiosyncrasy of a human hand's pressure on a surface. No triage corpsmen with ballpoint pens, and the particular genius of the person who first thought. Write the case number directly on the patient, because data terminals fail and patients don't. The census saw a surface deposit of ambiguous composition. It couldn't see what it meant, couldn't see that those 9 digits in that cramped legible hand were the most important data in the room. I sat in the sunlight a while. Then I stood up and walked to the nearest transit relay to begin the process of getting out of the territory. It took 11 more days, 6 passive scan checkpoints. Each one read my census entry, found it valid, and moved on. I want to tell you what those 11 days were like, because they are part of the story in a way that doesn't always come through when I describe the pavilion. The pavilion was where the crisis resolved. The 11 days of exfiltration afterward were where I learned what it meant to be on the other side of a resolution. The first checkpoint was at the Eastern Transit Relay of the Dorothea Civic Sector. Approximately 4 hours after I left the pavilion, a pair of Ethery field census units were running secondary confirmation scans on all individuals passing through the relay. Standard practice in the later stages of a sweep, confirming that all biometric signatures in the transit corridor matched registered census entries. I stood in the line, presented my wrist to the passive scan array in the relay housing, and waited while the system cross-referenced my deep biometric profile against the census database. The terminal returned a green status indicator. Registered, valid, no anomaly. The field census unit nearest me, one of the tall, pale biosynthetic forms, its facial structure neutral and its attention already moving to the individual behind me, gave the response that Ethery field units give to a clean scan result, which is nothing, no acknowledgement, no gesture, no eye contact. Clean scans generate no output because clean scans are the expected result. Anomalies generate output. I was not an anomaly. I passed through the relay and kept walking. The second checkpoint was harder. Not because anything went wrong. Nothing went wrong. But because it was at the edge of the settlement cluster, where Red O'Dall's support element was still positioned, and I passed within 200 meters of the relay station where he was based. And I could not stop. I could not detour. Detouring from a direct transit route in a continuous sweep area without a logged destination is the kind of behavior that flags you as potentially anomalous, and I was not going to generate a new anomaly flag 48 hours after surviving the one I'd just resolved. I walked past and kept my eyes forward and told myself I would call him when I was out. That was 11 years ago. The third checkpoint, the fourth, and the fifth were unremarkable in the way that all checkpoints become unremarkable when you are registered, and your census entry is clean. The scanners read you. The system returns a status. The status is valid. You move on. The psychological texture of those checkpoints was entirely different from anything I had experienced on previous deployments. Because on previous deployments, every scan had been a risk, and I had been managing the risk continuously. Now there was no risk. The system had me. I was in the database. It was the strangest feeling of the entire 12-day ordeal, and I have never been able to explain it adequately to people who haven't done this kind of work. After 6 years of managing the gap between what I was and what the Ethery census thought I was, the gap was gone, and the absence of the gap felt less like safety than like being watched in a new way. Not the threat watch of a system looking for an anomaly, the neutral, continuous, utterly impersonal watch of a system that had categorized you correctly and filed you, and was now simply keeping your data current. I was in the continuance's census. I was a data point. The ink was still on my wrist through all of it, fading steadily. The edges of the digits softening with each day of field exposure, but present. The sixth and final checkpoint, at the Northern Transit Node where I'd entered the sweep territory 17 days earlier, scanned me at the relay threshold and returned a valid census status. And I stepped through into the unregistered territory on the other side, and the sweep was behind me, and the ink was still there. I stood on the far side of the transit node for a moment. Then I kept walking. I want to be precise about what I was calculating at that moment. I stepped up to the terminal. Because it matters. Priority flag was at 96% propagation. The deep census scan takes 11 seconds. At the pavilion's current processing load, the network lag between the flag reaching 96% and reaching the terminal in front of me was somewhere between 25 and 40 seconds, depending on how congested the census broadcast frequency was in the Dorothea Civic District. I was estimating the midpoint, 2 seconds of lag. The scan took 11 seconds. The certificate generation took 21 seconds. Total, 32 seconds. From the moment I stepped up to the terminal to the moment the registration was complete. 32 seconds of processing time, 32 seconds of estimated lag. It was not a comfortable margin. It was not, in any honest assessment, a margin at all. It was a coincidence of timings I had not engineered and could not replicate. If the network had been 10 seconds less congested that day, the flag would have arrived before the certificate completed. If the queue had moved 30 seconds slower, it would have been. In standing at the clerk's station, when the priority alert appeared on the display, and the conversation would have been very different. I know this. I have known it for 11 years. And every time I go back over it, I arrive at the same place. The margin was not mine. The margin was Redo's. Not because he planned it. He didn't plan anything. He just ran out of data tablet and reached for a pen. But because the 32 seconds I needed to work with were only 32 seconds because the scanner had spent some fraction of its processing time on the ink. The low priority surface deposit flag, the environmental particulate classification, the routing to the review queue. That processing overhead, however small, was part of the timing. I cannot quantify it. I cannot tell you how many milliseconds the scanner spent classifying the ink before setting it aside. But the ink was the only variable I had that the E-theory system had not already accounted for. I told the authorities' debrief team a version of this that was accurate but incomplete. I described the detection event, the run to the pavilion, the registration, the certificate, and the exfiltration, because those were the material facts. I told them the timing had been extremely close, and that I had registered with approximately 30 seconds to spare before the priority flag arrived. The terminal. I did not tell them about the ink. I thought about it during the debrief. I sat across from the authorities' debrief officer, a careful, methodical woman named Esara Vol, who had been running deep survey debriefs for longer than I had been in the field, and who asked exactly the questions the facts required and did not speculate beyond them. And I thought about whether to tell her. I decided not to, and I want to explain the reasoning, because it is not the reasoning of someone protecting an asset for personal reasons. The issue is replicability. The ink on my wrist was Redo Dahl's habit, not a designed protocol. It was applied in a specific concentration of ballpoint ink on a specific area, skin, after a specific number of days of field exposure. The scanner that classified it as environmental particulate was the specific Vethara Pavilion scanner array, running on the specific firmware version the continuance had deployed for the 4th population sweep. I did not know whether the classification result would be the same for a different ink, a different application area, a different scanner array, or a different firmware version. More importantly, if I told Esara Vol, the authority would study it. They would test it. They would develop a protocol. And the development of a protocol would mean the creation of a record. Records have a way of propagating through systems. And the Ethery continuance is a civilization that is very, very good at finding information that exists in systems and acting on it. The moment the authority had a formal deep survey protocol involving analog ink-on-skin surface markings, probability of that information eventually reaching Ethery census analysts was not zero, and the probability of those analysts acting on it, updating the scanner classification algorithms, expanding the surface deposit vocabulary to include identified pen ink chemical signatures, was very high. I was not going to give that up for the sake of a clean debrief record. So I gave Esara Vol the accurate but incomplete version, and she accepted it, and the ink stayed mine. There was one moment in the debrief where I nearly told her. Esara Vol asked me whether there had been any variable in the pavilion interaction that I could not account for, any element that might have attributed to the narrow timing margin. It was a precise question. It was the right question. She was a good debrief officer, and good debrief officers ask the questions that the facts point toward even when they don't have a name for what they're pointing at. I told her the timing had been close enough that minor network congestion variations could account for it. This was true. It was not complete. She wrote it down, reviewed her notes, and moved on to the next item. I watched her write it down and thought, if I tell her, the authority will run tests. They will find a ballpoint pen, and they will write a triage string on a test subject's wrist, and they will run the test subject through a deep census scanner under controlled conditions. And they will have an answer in 72 hours. And that answer will go into a report. And the report will be classified, and the classification will be imperfect, because classifications always are. And eventually some Ethery census analyst will encounter a piece of that report through one of the indirect channels that exist in the corridor, and they will update the scanner firmware, and the window will close. I was not willing to risk that for the sake of a complete debrief record. The ink was the last variable I had that was genuinely mine, genuinely outside the system. I kept it. I kept it for 11 years, and now I'm giving it to the archive. Because the fourth population sweep ended 7 years ago, and the Ethery continuance is currently in a period census consolidation rather than active sweep expansion, and the specific scanner firmware from that sweep has been updated at least 3 times. Since then, the window that existed on the 31st day of the fourth sweep at the Vethara Intake Pavilion may not exist in the same form any longer, or it may. I genuinely don't know. Civilizational blind spots don't close quickly, because the Ethery don't know the spot is there. They classified the ink as environmental particulate. They set it aside for low priority review, unless some future archivist in the continuance's own census system has queried the low priority environmental particulate queue for the fourth sweep and noticed an unusual concentration of 9-digit surface deposit flags on the inner wrists of human registrants. The spot is still there. I doubt they've queried it. The continuance processes a census entry as complete when it's entered and valid. They don't generally go back to look at the low priority queue of an 8-year-old sweep registration, unless there's an active reason to. And they don't have an active reason to, because I never gave them one. The ink faded. They set it aside for review. They never got around to it. One more thing. I said I would tell you this, and I will. The ink faded in the ordinary way, ballpoint ink on skin, and Redo's own estimate had been 2 weeks. By the time I was on the transit relay back to the authorities' operational base, the edges of the string were already softening. By the time I reached base and sat through 3 days of standard debrief, the ink was a smear rather than a number. By the time I filed my report and took my post-deployment leave, it was gone. I noticed when it went. I was in the accommodation block on the Reach Perimeter Station, waking up on the 4th morning of leave, and I looked at my wrist in the morning light and the skin was clean. Not faded, clean, done. I spent the first 15 minutes of that morning deciding how I felt about that, and arrived at relieved. Not sad, not nostalgic, not actively grateful in any way that required expression. Relieved. The way you feel when something fragile you've been responsible for carrying for a long time has finally been set down somewhere safe. I had carried the knowledge of what that ink had done for 11 days through the Ethery sweep. Then I'd carried the secret of it for 11 years afterward, and the ink was the physical form of both, and now it was gone, and I could put it somewhere else. I put it here. The archivist across the table has stopped writing. He set his pen down somewhere around the 3rd time. I said Redo Dahl's name, and he's been looking at me with the expression of someone who's been doing this job for 2 years, and just heard the first genuinely surprising thing in all of it. I know that expression. I'm glad to have put it on his face. I'm going to call Redo Dahl now. I've been putting it off for 11 years, and I'm going to call him today, and I'm going to tell him that his professional habit, his insistence on writing the case number directly on the patient because data terminals were unreliable, his refusal to abandon a pre-digital protocol just because the current century offered something cleaner. I'm going to tell him that I owe him my life, and that the specific mechanism by which I owe him my life is so absurd that it's almost certainly going to make him laugh. He'll be insufferable about it. He's earned it. I looked at my wrist one more time before I left the table. Clean skin, faint lines of age, nothing else. Redo's ink has been gone for 11 years. But I can still feel it there sometimes. Ghost pressure of a pen moving in 30 seconds on a dusty hillside. 11 days before I needed it. The most important data in the room, written in an analog medium on a biological surface, by a corpsman who couldn't find his tablet. The Ethery continuance cataloged every cell in my body that day. They logged my bone density, my organ geometry, my metabolic gradients, my neural pathway estimates. They built a census entry for me that is, I am reliably informed, one of the most complete single individual registrations in the Vethara Pavilion's entire fourth sweep database. They put Redo's pen in the wrong category. They set it aside for review. They never got around to it. He couldn't find his tablet. That's the whole story. He couldn't find his tablet, so he used a pen. And 11 days later, the most sophisticated census instrument in 3 survey sectors looked at that pen and decided it was dust. I've had 11 years to find the right word for what that is. I keep coming back to the same one. Luck. Not ingenuity, not adaptability, not some profound statement about human civilization and its relationship to analog technology. Just luck, the specific kind that wears the shape of a pen in the wrong pocket, on the right day, in a field medic's hand. But I'll tell you this, I have never thrown away a ballpoint pen since. Not one. I have at this moment, sitting in the breast pocket of the jacket, hanging on the back of my chair, 2 ballpoint pens. One is a standard field supply item from the Reach perimeter stores, indistinguishable from the 10,000 others the authority distributes to its personnel every procurement cycle. The other is a pen that Redo Dahl gave me 2 years ago, when I ran into him at a transit hub on the Reach and spent 40 minutes catching up without telling him anything that mattered. He gave it to me because he had 3 in his kit, and he noticed I was writing in pencil. And he said a pencil was a bad habit in the corridor because graphite smears, and I took it, and I have carried it since. I am going to tell him today why I carry it. I am also going to tell him that his pre-digital triage protocol, his absolute refusal to trust a data terminal when a pen would do the same job, without the sync lag, is the reason I am sitting in this room having these conversations. Instead of being an archived resolution entry in the ETHARI, continuance's 4th sweep register. I am going to tell him this in as much detail as he can stand, and I am going to watch his face while I tell him, and whatever expression he makes, I intend to remember it for the rest of my life. Not one. Every field kit I've packed for the last 11 years has had at least one of them in an external chest pocket, because you never know when a data terminal is going to fail. And you never know when the most sophisticated census instrument in 3 survey sectors is going to put your case number in the wrong category. Redo Dahl understood that before any of us did. I'm going to call him now.